Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Falconer Natural History Lectures from the University of Albany's Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. My name is Mark Boharnwa. I will be your meeting host this evening. I will review our Zoom protocols, introduce tonight's lecture host, and will moderate the post-lecture question and answer period. Tonight's presentation, Ecological Restoration as a Practice of Healing, is the final Falconer lecture in our summer 2021 series. Before we get started, let's review our Zoom protocols. The lecture, all messages sent to the Zoom chat feature, and the post-lecture Q&A are being recorded. All participant video and audio has been disabled until the post-lecture Q&A period. You may submit comments or questions to the chat at any time. However, they will not be addressed until the post-lecture Q&A. Please do not use the Zoom raise your hand feature until the post-lecture Q&A period. Any raised hands will be addressed in the order they were received, and you will be asked to unmute to pose your question. You may also enable your video if you so choose. And as always, please remember, if you're going to ask a question, to make sure your background noise is at a minimum. Before introducing tonight's lecture host, I'll now play a brief video from ASRC's director, Dr. Christopher Thorncroft, providing a brief history of the Falconer lectures and an overview of ASRC.
Before we come to the speaker today, I wanted to say a little bit about the Ray Falconer, whose name is given to the summer series. So in 1961, Vince Schaefer founded the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center and shortly hired thereafter Ray Falconer as ASRC's very first full-time employee. Ray was often referred to as Mr. Weather. From his early days as a weather observer atop Mount Washington in New Hampshire to his work at the General Electric Research Laboratory in Nobel laureate Irving Langmuir's Project Cirrus, Ray was an enthusiastic disciple of the atmosphere. Ray's boundless energy was poured into public education on weather and the environment. His popular radio weather commentaries, his articles, and his lecture series made him widely known as the voice of the ASRC. Ray initiated this lecture series in the summer of '62 at Whiteface Mountain. And in 1973, ASRC expanded the series to include a spring version on the Albany campus, which is this present series. This series is deeply rooted in ASRC's history and offers scientists a unique opportunity to engage with the general public. Indeed, we have a fantastic slate of strong interdisciplinary talks this year. And I would like to thank Dr. Craig Ferguson and his committee for doing such a great job in creating such a strong slate. Before going on to introducing tonight's speaker, I wanted to say a few things about the center for those of you who may be less familiar with what's going on these days. I just want to highlight a few of the areas that we do that are important for the society and the state and the globe. We work on air quality and atmospheric chemistry, observations theory, including many observations that take place at our Whiteface Mountain facility. We do a lot of work on boundary layer meteorology, which is basically looking at the atmosphere close to the surface and how energy, temperature, and moisture are transmitted between the land and the lowest levels of the atmosphere. We also have a growing area in applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We've recently deployed some quite strong computing infrastructure to support machine learning through the Excite laboratory, and are contributing to a national institute, a $30 million institute in artificial intelligence and trustworthiness. We do lots of work in climate and weather, including extremes, and we also are very strong in renewable energy, wind and solar, to name but a few. Finally, just want to say that we're very excited about this summer. We are going to be moving into a new building, the so-called E-Tech building, this summer. And in this building, along with ASRC, we will be joined by the Department of Atmospheric Environmental Sciences, the New York State Mesonet, a Center of Excellence, the Excite Lab, as well as our local National Weather Service forecast office. a dream come true for bringing all of these entities together. And we will also be co-located with the new College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security and Cybersecurity, as well as environmental engineering. A huge opportunity to promote and continue interdisciplinary research.
So introducing tonight's speaker is Mr. Paul Casson. Paul is the operations manager at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center's Whiteface Mountain Field Station. He is a longtime member of the Whiteface Mountain Ski Patrol and currently serves as vice president of the Whiteface Mountain Regional Visitors Bureau. Prior to joining ASRC, Paul worked for 13 years as a field technician for the Adirondack Lake Survey Corporation, including serving as the site operator for the cloud collection system atop Whiteface Mountain. Paul?
Thank you, Mark. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Craig Milewski from Paul Smith College. Craig has been at Paul Smith College for 18 years. He currently coordinates the environmental science and ecological restoration programs. He teaches a variety of courses in environmental science, ecological restoration, fisheries and wildlife sciences, and environmental humanities. Past work experience has informed and enriched his teaching, and this includes watershed ecologist, project coordinator, and a watershed development district in South Dakota. Assistant fisheries research biologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And his education includes a PhD from South Dakota State University, where he studied stream ecology, and an MFA in writing, creative nonfiction and poetry at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Take it away, Craig.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's great to be here this evening. I was asked by Rich Brandt if I'd be willing to volunteer to give a presentation for the Falconer series, and I couldn't turn down Rich. I've known Rich Brandt for a long time. We used to be bicycling pals here in the Adirondacks. But anyways, ecological restoration as a practice of healing. Let me see if I can minimize that on my screen. Okay. Oops. So the first few slides here, ecological restoration as a practice of healing. Part of the reason I selected this as a title because I wanted to explore a little bit more myself. This idea of ecological restoration, not just as a way of healing the landscape, but also of perhaps healing our relationship with the land and water resources, building that connection and restoring that connection. So I'll see where this goes, and I'm happy to, at the end of this talk, to hear any of your ideas, thoughts, insights, anything you might like to share about this topic. But I'm going to share just a few boring slides here to introduce this idea of ecological restoration before I share a few examples. So what I hope to convey in this presentation is pretty straightforward. This idea that ecological restoration has emerged as a discipline aimed at restoring ecosystem function and biodiversity, social and ecological resilience in a changing climate, and perhaps even a more harmonious relationship to our ecology. And I hope also to convey the promise and appeal of ecological restoration as a practice of healing and as a shared lived community experience. So, conversation with ourselves. I borrow that from a title from a presentation of Alan Watts from 1972, Conversation with Myself. So I thought, well, why not a conversation with ourselves? I wish I could figure out how to get rid of this top bar here. That's okay, I'll work around it. So what is ecological restoration? The very simple definition provided by the Society of Ecological Restoration is this: assisting the recovery of degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystems. And I always try to put the emphasis on the word assisting the recovery rather than any big, huge manipulation. So this definition itself implies, in a way, minimal intervention. So where to begin? Where to begin with all this? Well, ecological restoration, of course, is going to require knowledge of ecosystem structure and function, including things like this natural disturbance regimes, succession and such. It's going to require historical knowledge and legacy effects. How have we affected the landscape in the past, and how are those impacts still registered on the landscape today, and how they might be limiting what we can do in terms of restoration. And also understanding our relationship to land. Everyone has a different relationship to land. Some people feel very intimate, close connection, and others may feel less connected or even disconnected, or and such. So I think these three areas are very important in order for ecological restoration to proceed in any successful way. I think every time I have a conversation about ecological restoration, it seems to beg two simple questions. Is climate change having the biggest impact on ecosystems, on an ecosystem's resilience? That is the ability to recover following a disturbance. I know there's a lot of definitions of resilience out there, but what about other impacts? What about habitat loss and fragmentation, air and water pollution, soil loss, development, and that's supposed to be and overconsumption of resources, invasive species, and also our broken relationship with our ecology. And these have always been there. And when I was an undergrad, this is mostly what we focused on. And I did not hear too much about climate change in the early 80s. And the second question I often have is like, well, what's our best ecological solution to climate change, while at the same time addressing these other impacts? And I would suggest, just put out there a suggestion, that ecological restoration may be one of the top solutions to climate change. Not the only one, of course, but one in a toolkit. So not only does it address climate change, but it inherently addresses all the other human impacts as well. And I don't like to load a slide with a bunch of quotes, but I'm going to put a couple in here. And I tried to search back further for some other ones. I thought Rachel Carson actually made a comment about climate change. But anyways, the discipline of ecological restoration ecology. Ecological restoration was formalized as a profession in 1988-89. The Society of Ecological Restoration was formed. And this ecologist Bradshaw, this is a often quoted sentence here: the acid test of our understanding is not whether we can take ecosystems to bits on paper, however scientifically, but whether we can put them together in practice and make them work. And even E.O. Wilson in 1992 said, here's the means to end the great extinction spasm. The next century, I believe, will be the era of restoration in ecology. And recently, some of you may know that the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2021 to 2030 as a decade on ecosystem restoration, following a proposal for action by over 70 countries, and it was adopted in March 2019. So this is, if you wanted to go online and learn more about that initiative, you can, and it focused largely on people's livelihoods, how to counteract climate change, and also stop the collapse of biodiversity. Those are, I think, three of the major goals of this initiative for the next 10 years. So I also think it's important to understand ecological restoration in these terms, in that it has evolved as a discipline, it has evolved as a profession, and as any good profession develops, it arrives at some kind of principles, not necessarily etched in stone, but to help guide people through as they learn from experience and debate and such. So there are 8 principles underpinning ecological restoration. And this is published in 2018, I think, in the journal Restoration Ecology or Ecological Restoration. I'm not too sure right now. But there's 8 principles. 1, it engages stakeholders. 2, it draws on many types of knowledge, including indigenous knowledge. It's informed by native reference ecosystems while considering the changes that are occurring due to the environment. It supports ecosystem recovery processes. It's assessed against clear goals and objectives using measurable indicators. It seeks the highest level of possible recovery. It gains cumulative value when applied at large scales, and is part of a continuum of restorative activities. And I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of them. Let me see if I can get rid of this. There we go. All right. So this idea of the social benefits that you can find throughout these principles, there's value of intentionality, integrating and assessing the social benefits of ecological restoration. This wheel, this recovery wheel for social benefits, is actually found in the documents for the 8 principles. And you can see this focuses on community well-being, knowledge enrichment, sustainable economies, natural capital, stakeholder engagement, all these things. And going from the center of the circle outward, you can actually assess to what extent a project may be actually supporting these social benefits. I think it's also very important. Some people don't quite understand that ecological restoration isn't just going to a site and deciding what you want to do with it. You may get similar results, but really ecological restoration is tries to gauge of impacted sites, tries to gauge itself against reference conditions. And again, the highest level of restoration is sought. This is an example of 2 recovery wheels, but this time related to the ecological characteristics, structure and function of ecosystems. And it can be used to assess baseline conditions, pre-restorations, and also 10 years post-treatment. And you can see that this is rather, what I would say, rather comprehensive at this point in time. It's a great way to gauge whether a restoration project, how close can come to a complete restoration or otherwise. And this idea, I know the site of ecological restoration has a landscape, what do I want to call it? Landscape, not chapter, but group that focuses on how ecological restoration can help store these larger landscapes that have been dramatically affected. So there is some cumulative value to restoration. And I think it's important to make a note that it may not always be possible to fully recover native ecosystems. So there's a continuum of restoration activities. And I think this came about as a result of a lot of debate. What is ecological restoration? How does it fit on some kind of continuum? And of course, there's, in a city, what can you do? You can try to reduce societal impacts by maybe retrofitting actions that try to mimic hydrology in some ways, keeping the water on the landscape rather than running it down streets. And I think what part of the reason why this came about, because there was always some discussion, well, what isn't ecological restoration just remediation or rehabilitation? And I think this scale, this continuum here, is actually quite helpful. Another perspective on types of ecological restoration, and I use this many times to describe the types of restoration that, and this somewhat reflects the continuum that might be possible or desirable. A complete restoration attempts to restore an ecosystem to a close approximation of its pre-disturbance condition. Any ecologist knows that you can't mimic the last several thousand years or more, tens of thousands of years of ecosystem genesis. But this is one attempt to arrive at a close approximation of pre-disturbed conditions. There's functional restoration, and this is an attempt to restore important structural and functional traits. And say, for example, a watershed where you have a lot of agriculture. It's not as if everyone's going to say, let's convert all this to tallgrass prairie or mixed hardwood forest. But maybe some things in the watershed can be restored to help soil and water conservation, for example. And then experiential restoration. This is restoration aimed at creating an experience. And whatever that may be, educational in many regards, And you might see this type of restoration occurring in small parks. So just an example. And so I think I have three examples in this presentation. So this is just a short reflection. I had a good fortune about, I don't know, 8 years ago, no, not that long ago, to go over to Ethiopia to bring some students over there. I had a good friend who had connections, and he served as a guide along with one of his friends at a university over there. And so I just wanted to start off in another country and then bring it right back to our own college campus. And we actually stayed at let's see, a small campus down in this area. Very interesting. We had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Nagash, a professor at Addis Ababa University. The students dubbed him Aldo of Africa. I don't know if that's, it should have been Aldo of Ethiopia, perhaps. But anyways, the students were called him that, labeled him that, for the simple reason he was really into his work. And he brought us out to one of his restoration sites. He had a small watershed that he was working on. And he brought this picture with him to show us what the landscape in this area looked like prior to restoration. And we also visited some sites where eucalyptus trees and introduced species from Australia was growing, and he did not have anything good to say about eucalyptus trees. It makes the forest look like this. Apparently, due to some chemical that these trees put out, that a lot of vegetation just simply can't survive, so it creates a bare ground, exposes it to high erosion. And we also had a really good opportunity to meet a fellow by the name of Mr. DeCabo, who's the director of the RC Nature Conservation Environmental Development Association. We spent a fair amount of time with him, and he took us to a lot of sites and actually got us involved in a couple of community projects, planting trees and actually engaging with some folks with the Biodiversity Institute there. For them, ecological restoration was part of a lot of activities to restore ecological resilience, but also social resilience as well. The Biodiversity Institute over there created the botanical gardens to grow indigenous vegetation for restoration at sites. This is quite an experience, actually. And we visited some of these sites, and you can just see just how eroded this landscape is. It's beyond what you would call natural. Natural erosion does occur, but this was beyond that. A lot of it had to do with overgrazing, but also some of it had to do with the fact that the flatter uplands where farming practices occurred, water would run off and over into these deeper areas and create disturb the landscape in some pretty serious ways. And this is a picture that either I or one of the students took, and some pretty massive gully formation due to altered hydrology. Of course, it affected their lake and stream ecology. So all that stuff, these processes, these problems that occur in other countries, very similar to the processes and problems we experience in our country. Essentially, these degraded sites, the watershed shifted from toward a runoff surface water system, and restoring the vegetation. The point here was to shift them back toward an infiltration groundwater system. Desired outcomes were things like carbon sequestration, biodiversity, restored hydrology, soil retention, improved water quality, but also community participation and satisfaction. So Mr. DeCabo was able to organize these communities, and we met with this group of Ethiopians early one morning, and this is a couple different trips, and we worked with all these individuals to plant trees. And these were native plantings. The Biodiversity Institute provided all these plants, and I think it was 3 truckloads of these plants in a very short order were planted by that heavy community involvement. But also part of this work was placing rock barriers in these gullies. And you can see here, this is the upslope side versus the downslope. And the idea here was to slow the water down, capture the soil, and hold the moisture as well, and start to allow vegetation to grow along with the tree plantings. And here's just another example of that: upslope, downslope. And again, this is just another view. But I was just so impressed. The students were so impressed when we came out to this site. We got a chance to engage with everyone, and very hardworking individuals working side by side. In short order, this whole place was planned. It'd always be nice to go back and see what this place looks like. But coming back home to the Adirondacks, I know if you're listening to this, you know it's a rich natural heritage, it's a rich cultural heritage. It's considered a model of sustainability, and it's, well, and is it successful? How successful it is? So I've heard people describe it as a big experiment. When I was talking to, I wish I could remember not who now, about the Adirondacks and our new ecological restoration program here at Paul Smith College several years ago. And he said, well, the Adirondack Park is one big ecological restoration project. I said, yeah, it really kind of is. But the park itself, what do I want to say about that? I only put this here just as a guide to show some of you where Paul Smith College is, if you're not sure. We're in the northern part of the Adirondacks on Lower St. Regis Lake. And of course, we have a lot of diverse ecosystems around us and available to us. But the thing I want to bring up is, and I often talk to students about this, it's like, well, for example, we have this little shoreline out here that has a barrier or a break wall that's falling apart. And I tell the students, we're looking at this lake, there 99% of the shoreline is in great shape. So is this really going to change the world, save the world? And of course, the answer is no, but it certainly provides, it's a small case study. I describe it as a small case study with big lessons. And it is a way to showcase what can be done to certain shorelines if people really would like to do that. And for some pretty good reasons. So a shoreline that has a break wall on it, certainly there's loss of fragmentation and loss of connectivity, loss of physical habitat, loss of biodiversity. The motivation for studying the shore was our new program. Its social cultural relevance, its relatedness to the college mission, etc. And it's also a small manageable project. And the big one it turned out to be was to reduce the geese population up on the lawn. I will certainly not go through all this, but we've had a long list of studies related to the shoreline project, several different programs involved, and several different courses involved as well. So again, a small case study with big lessons. It's a model of experiential restoration. Now, right in the foreground here, this is where the student center is now. This is a picture prior to this place being developed. And it gives you an idea what the shoreline looked like in some places. And of course, before Paul Smith College was here, the Paul Smith Hotel was here. And some of the post-settlement changes were the dams, which changed shoreline dynamics, water quality declined seriously, and native fish communities were pretty much lost. And just look at this, a 365 acre lake with 177 cottages and dorms for the staff, 17 rooms for hotels. So you can just imagine the impact that many people could have on a very small lake. Anyways, to the case study. This is what the shoreline looks like. This is a shoreline where natural processes are intact. One of the things that's important to understand is the shoreline is on the windward side of the lake, and in areas where there's vegetation, the wind speed is reduced quite dramatically compared to those areas where there is no vegetation. We know that there is an air cushion effect of having vegetation on the shoreline, so it'll slow the air down in front of the, or on the windward side as well as the downward side, of course. But the other thing I wanted you to note is that many shorelines that are intact have a large woody structure alongside them, and you can see how it calms the water. So it reduces wind speed as a result of having tall vegetation, but the logs fall in the lake and reduce the water agitation. And these areas actually help retain leaves, coarse particulate organic matter, and fine organic matter. There was a study in Wisconsin where they removed the shoreline woody debris, and all the coarse and fine particulate matter got washed out into the center and deeper part of the lake. So keeping that organic matter close to shore might not be such a bad idea for a healthy ecosystem. So we designated 3 different levels of impact: impacted, minimally impacted, and lower St. Reaches. Then we picked another lake as a reference condition. The reference conditioning have natural processes in place for some time, minimally impacted on the lake where natural processes and patterns are starting to occur. And then of course an impacted site. These are the sites. I'll keep moving along here. So shoreline vegetation and organic matter sources and retention. We had a standardized sampling for all the different studies that were ongoing. They all overlaid with each other. And very, very quickly, I just want to showcase a couple interesting characteristics comparing impacted versus minimally impacted in reference conditions. I circled the impacted sites or impacted results so you could quickly focus in on them. The canopy cover was certainly much lower at impacted sites. Obligate wetland species were lower at impacted sites and higher at minimally impacted and reference sites. Facultative upland species were much higher at the impacted sites, suggesting more terrestrial-like conditions and reduction in more wetland type conditions, partly due to fill. Let's see here. The volume of woody debris was much lower at the impacted sites compared to the others. Autumn leaf litter at the impacted sites, which was much lower compared to the adjacent terrestrial zone. So the leaf litter was at these sites was essentially being washed away, where at these other sites it was being retained, and sometimes even more than what was being dropped on the shoreline. The coarse particulate organic matter was very high at the reference site in terms of dry weight per well, this is the sampling device here, basically a tube, and virtually absent, or I should say non-measurable at the impacted sites. Organic matter in the soils was much lower at the impacted sites. Bulk density, which was higher at the impacted sites, meaning the soil was compacted. And again, these were areas that also were, a lawnmower was being used to regularly cut the vegetation. So probably being packed down on a regular basis. Interesting enough, at the impacted sites, the number of insects per sweep net, I believe that's what it is here, was higher than the impacted sites. At the minimally impacted reference site, what was interesting, there was an interaction. The arachnids densities were rather high. So there might be some kind of interesting invertebrate interaction going on. The aquatic macroinvertebrates on the woody structure was much lower. And this is per unit, density per 1 meter sweep. So it's interesting, standardizing that way, it was minimal on the impacted sites, or lower, I should say, at impacted sites than the others. What was interesting across all sites in organic matter, the presence of families found was much, much higher. The family level richness was much higher in organic matter than inorganic or mixed substrate types alongside the lakes. Beautiful, rich stuff. Impacted sites, the density of odonates was much lower. So I think you can start to get the picture here that these impacted sites, the processes were, the circuits, the way the energy can move through these systems was seriously reduced, substantially reduced. as well as, and then the impacts of that on biodiversity were pretty substantial as well. And I also should mention here that the catch of age zero fish was much, much lower at the impacted sites and minimally impacted sites out on Lower St. Regis Lake. I'm going to skip this just for the sake of time, but we did do a fish diet analysis. What I did want to make a point, this is the site that we would like to restore. And in late summer, there's no place that you can walk through here without tiptoeing through the fecal matter. And we did a survey of what people thought about this site. And one individual wrote, I get a rundown kind of feeling, unnatural, public, boring, very overused. And so we targeted that. And a survey was done to determine what people prefer. And 75% of faculty, students, and staff preferred moderately impacted sites with trees or minimally impacted sites. 25% preferred these sites here, the more severely impacted sites. So there was support, and we did this survey twice, 5 years apart, and the results were very similar. And so plans have been made for restoration of this site. And so it just needs to be implemented. And hopefully this is not the site. Hopefully this is what the site will look like in time. Let me check my time here real quick. Oh, I'm doing good. Another site project that I want to share is this meadow restoration project. So ecological restoration as a practice of healing. I just want to quickly come back to that theme. What does that mean, is healing? Again, it's the healing of the land, but also maybe our connection to our ecology, which means just understanding it, engaging it, and enjoying it. We've also referred to this meadow restoration project. We refer to the study sites as pollinator plots or no-mow zones. So those words get interchanged a lot. So here we are on campus, and I think this was on the one website. And I just quickly looked at this. It has a lot of scientific information in here, so it's not the primary literature. But this is on a website. Green lawns are an ecological catastrophe. And some of the information they shared there, I wrote it down. NASA estimates that in the United States, 63,248 square miles of lawn exists, turf lawn. And another study suggests there may be more acres of lawn than there are combined, compared to the combined 8 largest irrigated crops. It's shown that lawns require more labor, use of equipment, fuel, and pesticides and herbicides than industrial farms. The average American mows the lawn 22 times a year. I think somewhere in there it said 55 or 60% of the people who mow don't like to mow, so that might be some incentive to not mow. Synthetic fertilizers in the fabrication process produce CO2 and methane. The high decibels of leaf blowers. I know it puts me on edge when I am near one of those. And in fact, some towns are starting to put limits on the times that leaf blowers can be used, for example. And there's many other reasons why one could make this statement that green lawns are an ecological catastrophe. I know it's easy to look at one lawn, say, well, what's the big deal? But I know as many of you are ecologically minded, it's not the one lawn, it's like cumulative effects of thousands of lawns. So mowing, we've been thinking about mowing as a disturbance. I mean, there's good valid rationale for reducing our level of mowing here on campus. We thought, well, okay, and suddenly for some reason, there was a desire to create no-mow zones. And I thought, this is great. We can turn this into a restoration ecology and an ecological restoration project. So these are some of the sites, I don't need to describe them in any detail, sites that are regularly mowed, or were anyways. And it's like, well, let's get on this right away, and let's take some measurements, some basic meadow measurements. to at least collect some initial data before these are too far along. And I guess I don't need to say too much about this. We know that in the Adirondack forest succession occurs if there's blowdowns, burns, whatnot. Metals are part of the Adirondack environment. So maybe, and is part of early succession in many cases. Let's see, I won't spend too much time on that, but I tried to find some shots of meadows here in the Northeast, and here's examples of some upland meadows. I don't know if these, I got to be honest and say that I don't know if these are restored sites or not. I just quick grabbed these off the internet, and there you have that. Then there's wet meadows, so it's upland meadows, wet meadows, and the reason I'm sharing these is because as we started going to these sites, we noticed some of the sites were dry, and had slopes, and were quite different from another set of sites where no mowing was going to occur that seemed to be moist and flat. And then we selected some reference sites as well. This is a site on a power line. It periodically, the trees get cut for the simple reason that there's a power line there. So it's, in a way, you could say there's a little bit of periodic disturbance that maintains these meadow conditions. And some of the work that some of the variables that we looked at was vegetation cover, leaf litter depth, soil type, soil root depth, plant root biomass, terrestrial invertebrates, and it's ongoing. So this will be the third fall, I think, where we continue to collect data at these sites, and it's interesting. Very quickly, so the dry slopes and the moist flats are the sites that were mowed for I have no idea, years as far as I know. And the soil bulk density, which is the weight of soil per unit volume, was much higher in the dry slope and moist flats than the reference sites on average. There's a lot of variation, tremendous amount of variation out there. So the reference sites, apologize for the misspelled word there, the reference sites are not mowed. There might be some footpaths going through these areas, but that's about it. Disturbance is very, very infrequent. The dry root biomass on the dry slopes was lower than the moist flats in the reference sites. And let's see, okay, I did throw this one in, good. So it wasn't a super strong relationship, but there was a significant negative relationship between dry root biomass and soil bulk density. And so at some of these sites that we go back to over time, with the cessation of mowing and the compaction of soil and the chance for vegetation to grow and the root biomass to increase, we would expect anyways to see bulk density, soil bulk density decrease at the restored sites. We'll see.
Hey, Craig, we'll give you another 3 or 4 minutes if that's okay. Okay, that's just fine. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to just quick get to this here. I'll close with this a reflection. And thanks, Paul, for letting me know. Or is that Mark maybe? I don't know now. So very quickly, when I think of ecological restoration, when we developed the program here, we knew it was going to be more than just about the ecology. And we knew that we could tie this in with larger educational purposes here. So the question, I often go to Leopold's work, and whenever I have questions, and I ask the question, what would Leopold do? And he was famous for saying that students need to learn to see the land, understand what they see, and enjoy what they understand. And my own background, I came here from South Dakota that was in an area that used to be tall grass prairie, and virtually most of it's gone, where I was working as a watershed development district, as a watershed ecologist. And this is the kind of thing that you would still see ongoing. This is actually from Western Minnesota. And we know that there's a truth model that attempts to minimize bias through all these different traits. And we know that this science is embedded in the management process in many different ways. But
one could ask the question, are there other ways of perceiving and experiencing that are valid and relevant to ecological restoration? Higgs, who's a restoration ecologist, has a statement here: maintaining a broader approach to restoration requires respect for other kinds of knowledge than science, and especially the recognition of a moral center that's beyond the scope of science to address fully. And so, like the forest, sometimes human, and I could speak for myself, goes through a decomposition and composting phase and starts to look at life a little bit differently and presents these ideas to students even a little bit differently. So there is an intersection between levels of biological organization, history and its legacy effects and worldviews. What does that mean? Just exploring that, reflecting on that, having this experience and understanding what it is exactly that you're learning and what it might mean. Let me see here. I'll skip to this slide and I'll close it with this slide here. So we had a shaman come to the campus several years ago, and he packed the Adirondack room here at the library, and he was speaking through an interpreter, and he was from Nicaragua, and somebody raised their hand and asked a question. Well, he posed this idea. He says, as professors, it's our job is to help students to become wise. Someone raised their hand, not me, and asked, well, how do we do that? He just simply waved his hand toward the lake and said, have them sit by the lake. And of course, how does that make anyone wise? And I think if someone sits by the lake long enough, I know I do, I think about where it is, how do I fit in all this? How do I integrate in what new things can emerge out of myself as a professor, or how can I help students go a little bit deeper with things and experience the ineffable? And so we do, now this is the last slide. And so we do that here. Not only do we engage directly in ecological restoration, but we do take the time to sit and reflect. And I do like this. I don't mind saying I like this quote by Rachel Carson very much. And this was related to healing. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. There's something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night, spring after winter. And I think partly the impetus for me thinking about this is just the last 2 years and how incredibly challenging it was on so many different levels for so many different peoples in so many different ways. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Craig. That was extremely interesting. And I, for one, am really looking forward to learning a lot more about this and the whole idea of ecological restoration. And I have some questions in my mind and things that I'd like to ask, but we're going to open this up to the audience now. And if there's anyone out there in our audience who would like to ask some questions, you can either add it to the chat and I'll read it, or you can raise your hand with the Zoom raise your hand feature. So looks like Craig Ferguson has our first question. Who funds ecological restoration work in New York? And what are the most common development targets? Are these site, watershed, or state scale?
You know, I can say that I can't give you a good answer for that, to be honest. I would think if there's any ecological restoration work done in the state of New York, and if someone knows the answer, can provide a better answer, I'm completely open to it. As far as ecological restoration in New York, I would suggest that probably the agencies that are closest to doing this kind of work might be the Natural Resource Conservation Service, a federal agency. We actually have a student working in Watertown who went through this program and is working with the NRCS on wetland restoration. So I don't know if there's any department, agency that has the charge of ecological restoration. I'll just throw this out there. There is a state nearby that does have a Department of Ecological Restoration, and that is the state of Massachusetts. They've had a Department of Ecological Restoration for some time, and perhaps that could serve as a model for other states to follow. It's not the best answer, but that's the best I can give you at this point.
No, that's fine. That's great. Actually, it's interesting that Massachusetts does have a specific department targeted for that. Anyone else in the audience who would like to ask a question for Craig or pose a comment? Please do so. Oh, we have a raised hand, Rich Brandt. So I'm going to ask Rich, ask to unmute. Hopefully, Rich, you'll be able to unmute. Go ahead and ask your question.
It out. Yeah, that's a wonderful talk, Craig. It's amazing, actually. And what fascinates me is that it's possible to quantify restoration. Just atmospheric science is pretty straightforward to quantify different variables, but all of the things that you do to evaluate the degree of restoration. One thing that must make it really challenging these days is climate change. And it does occur to me that in the Adirondacks, as you had said, we are kind of in a state, a lot of the wilderness has actually been left alone for 100 years, and it's becoming a really nice reference of what restoration could be. For climate change, is it possible to, or do you think about the reference cases changing with time so that you have to sort of, as you plan the future of a watershed or a shoreline, to sort of factor in what changes you might expect for climate change?
That's a good question. How do you factor in the effects of climate change on ecological restoration, endpoints, and things like that? I've heard ecological restoration described this way. It's a process with a lot of people who are on the stage in a skit, and they only have half the. They're on the stage and they only have half the skit written out or something like that. In other words, it's hard to say exactly what the endpoints, what the trajectories, what the possible states are going to be. And I think the important thing here is looking for those best reference conditions that currently exist and monitoring those as well to see how climate affects those. And those might be the better indicators of some of the possible trajectories that a restored site can go to. One of the things that I try to impress on the students, and I think it relates to this question, is that when you look at reference sites, do you want to look at one reference site or two or three? Because we looked at three, we can go to 3 different reference sites and find quite a bit of variation among those sites. And so how is climate change, moisture and temperature going to influence not just variation within a site, but among sites? I think it's one of those questions, Rich, where we just have to monitor and learn as we go, because we don't always know. I don't believe we can. I think with a little humility and understanding that we don't always know where things are going to go, but certainly the long-term monitoring. I think long-term monitoring has more value than we even realize sometimes, even on small scales. Does that suffice, Rich? Okay.
Great question, Rich. Thank you. Craig, looks like we have another question here from Carson Wohlers. What would you recommend a common person do to reduce the ecological impact of a large area of mowed lawn?
That's a good question. You know, actually, if you wanted to do that, there's a lot of information on the internet on how to restore or turn a lawn into more natural vegetation. This would fall in that category, I think, of functional restoration or experiential restoration. It could be fun to just try. The big thing would be to, in your area, determine where you would find a seed source. what would be the natural vegetation there? What would be the seed source? And then how would you prep the site? How would you remove the turf or kill the turf? And then again, how would you prep the site? What kind of seeds do you need? What's indigenous to the area? That would be my best recommendation. It's just get online. There are people out there that do this for a living, actually. Not that you need to get a consultant to do this work, but there's plenty of information out there. Here's what we're doing here. We've just stopped mowing. So we're going to see what happens when we stop mowing. And we'll look at the species composition. And if it looks like it's primarily naturalized species and we'd like to try and get in more indigenous species, then we'll find a seed source here in the Northeast that will allow us to seed these sites. And it might just be a matter then of scratching the surface, seeding the areas. Some of the soils do not have a lot of organic matter, so it might require some kind of fertilization until things get going. Yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you.
Experiment.
Yeah. Ellen Haas, her question, what other ecological restoration programs is Paul Smith's College enacting in addition to lawns and shorelines?
Well, those are the two main ones right now that we're putting underneath the label of ecological restoration. The program is still fairly new and we're getting our feet underneath us. What the third one that I would like to work on is increasing habitat complexity in forest stands. Several years ago, some forestry students put together a plan to create another forest ecological restoration demonstration site over at the Visitor Interpretive Center, another 5-acre plot where they would the plans would be to intentionally increase the volume of dead wood, trees, stumps in these areas that are really in early successional stage, like so many of the forest stands are around here anyways. Increasing, so that's something that we're going to probably pursue a little bit more. I've been talking with one of our forest professors here about that. These are small projects that we're working on, and given our resources and what exactly we do here, that's what we focus on.
Great, thank you, Craig. I'd like to ask one question, take this opportunity to ask you one question. I was intrigued by the wheel diagram that you were presenting early on, and the importance of all those different components and how they interact together. The one I'm particularly interested in is the stakeholder component. And it would seem to me, and I think you mentioned this, that local indigenous population knowledge is very important. And related to that, then the question is, in the ecological restoration program at Paul Smith's, do you integrate the local indigenous population and the knowledge that they possess? It would seem like that would be a vital component to the success of these programs.
No, on these small projects we have not, but it's not out of the question. One of the ways I would answer your question, Mark, is I myself am currently learning more about the social sciences, if you will, and because I don't have that background. And I don't mind saying at all that these ecological restoration projects require a lot of areas of expertise. One of our social science professors here has been engaging with, let's see, the Akwesasne tribe, I believe. We do have a individual, and I wish I could remember her name right now, that will be coming to campus. And so we're trying to develop that relationship. And I'll ask her that question that you asked me. what can we do to engage people that may have that kind of knowledge? That's a good question.
That's great. Yeah, we're also trying to do that in the atmospheric sciences as well with our facility at Whiteface Mountain. So we're going to be engaging the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, high school students in the fall and in the spring. So I think that's really key. So a couple more minutes here. We'll allow anyone who has a late question or comment to either raise their hand or post their question in the chat. I don't see any raised hands at the moment, so I'm not going to focus on that. Anything else in the chat? Great comments and questions from everyone. And Craig, it was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks, Mark.
I think on that note, we're not seeing any other questions come forward or raised hands. So I think we'll end it there. Everyone give, we have some clapped hands going on. Richard, thank you. So thank you very much, Craig. We appreciate your talk and very informative, very timely, I think, and very important. So we look forward to good things from Paul Smiths.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the invite. Thanks again too, Rich. I know you're still there, so.
Thank you.
All right, on that note, thank you everyone for your attendance and your interactive questions. We appreciate it. And that ends our Falconer series for the summer. We look forward to seeing everyone in the spring for our spring series. If you scroll back at the beginning of your chat, there is a link that Dr. Craig Ferguson placed for our survey. We would love to have your feedback on the series and also any suggestions you might have for future topics and future speakers for the Falconer lectures. So we want this to be engaging for you. And if you have some unique and innovative speakers, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you again for a wonderful talk, Craig. Everyone, please enjoy the rest of your summer and everyone stay safe.
See you later.
Thank you.